So I'll do a quick presentation on the policy blueprint on DBT in education. As you know, it's a huge area of work which has been going around the world in terms of how to use DBT most effectively, either to meet the lack of resources that people suffer from, or to nudge their behavior in a particular direction. Right? So DBT has been used in different forms, largely to achieve two of those functions. Right? And both of them are actually quite pertinent and relevant for situation that we have in India. Right? So the first slide that I have is from Niti Aayog. This is their 3-year plan or action agenda they put forward. The reason I want you to see this slide more clearly is because this summarizes all what we have been arguing for in the last 8 school choice conferences, right? So it captures, in a sense, what is not working, what is not likely to work, right, in the current scenario quite effectively. Something we have been saying from the day one in terms of research that we have done in small places, the experience internationally on this issue, right? So all the focus which has been so far on the inputs, right, in the education. Right? Classic example, obviously, is the Right to Education Act itself, right, which focuses on inputs, infrastructure, teacher qualifications, and teacher salaries, right? In that sense, don't really deliver the result that we are looking for in terms of learning outcomes. Right? And that is now, I think, very well established, well accepted also by the government, right? And Niti Aayog's sort of action agenda captures that quite succinctly, what is not likely to work in improving education in the country. Right? I think that is where the DBT comes in the picture. So DBT is a way of bypassing some of the hurdles, some of the challenges that we face in improving education in the country. Right? Now quickly sort of give you some ideas about DBT. I'm happy to also have Junaid to join us to give us a little more global perspective on what is happening in the DBT space around the world. Right? It's also going to be very informative for us to understand how the ways of applying it and the learnings from those applications are relevant for India. Right? India, of course, has tried a couple of pilot programs. I'll talk about that briefly in my presentation. But we have not done much in the DBT space, in the education sector particularly. So with the Niti Aayog slide, I think I'm bypassing my usual sort of talk about what is not working and what we should be focusing on, right? So I think that captures quite well what we have been arguing for last 8 school choice conferences. What I want to do quickly is to give you the basic challenge in education, and nothing new there, and how DBT can then begin to address those challenges. Right? How can it be implemented in education? How can you design a particular DBT scheme? What are the broad parameters of such a scheme that we need to keep in mind so that it be effective in the country? Some of the challenges of implementation that we are likely to face. And at the end, throughout a couple of ideas in terms of how we can start a pilot program on DBT in some parts of the country. So that's my basic sort of focus for the presentation. So the challenges of education, there are both sides to it, the demand side and the supply side. Right? On the demand side, we still have challenges of poor parents who cannot afford to send children to school, though of course, far smaller numbers than it has been in the past. Right? There are also cultural factors, social factors which prevent particularly lower caste and girls from accessing beyond primary education. Right? So that is other constraint that we have in terms of the cultural dimension to this problem. On the supply side, we have challenges of schools not being available in some parts of India, but though also that is also not as common and as of a large concern as it used to be before. Right? Bigger concern obviously is not just access to schools, but the quality of education that happens in these schools. Right? So on the supply side, challenge is not so much about how many schools we need to have and how many we do have, but what actually happens in those schools. Right? And so quality of education is a consistent concern. All of you know about the Assar report, not just the Assar report, which was not usually accepted by the government as a legitimate commentary on India's learning levels, Now we have a NAS, which is government's own assessment done, right? Which also shows similar declining standards of learning across the elementary education in the country. Right? So in a sense, there's enough evidence to show that the current schooling system that we have is not delivering on the quality aspect of education. Right? So it has brought people to school, right? Maybe it has provided them decent uniforms, some textbooks, midday meal in most cases, but beyond that, the learning itself is still a bigger challenge. What I would argue is that DBT addresses both sides of this problem. It addresses the demand side of the problem, as well as the supply side of the problem, and which is why I am particularly very excited about the idea and how it can be used effectively in the country. So there are 3 different ways you can deliver DBT. Right? So one is unconditional cash transfer. Of course, here you are simply giving cash to parents and hoping that they would use the cash for the purpose also for nutrition, health, and education. It assumes, as I point out, that parents are going to be focused on education as a value for themselves and their families. Right? The second way to deliver DBT is a conditional cash transfer. Right? Here you're attaching some conditions. In case of education, usually it's about attendance in the school. It could be also about the learning levels that student must attain to remain in the program. Right? So you can attach some condition to the conditional cash transfer and thereby nudge people to do certain things that we think they should be doing with the help of the CCT. Right? The third way of delivering DBT is a voucher. Other form of voucher is also reimbursement. Voucher, as you can see, in some ways addresses the challenge of the parent who do not have money to pay for a school. Voucher would enable them to pay for the school. But more importantly, it's a sense of signal to the supply side, to the service provider. There are people with this kind of demand in their hand, voucher in their hand, who are likely to access your services if you're willing to provide a quality service to them. Right? So voucher, unlike the other way, is far more directly targeted towards supply side challenge of the education market. Right? So overall, all 3 or 4 different ways of delivering DBT address the demand as a supply side of the market. What you see on the other end is a trust on parents is going down as you go down the sequence from unconditional cash transfer to conditional cash transfer, and from there to vouchers. Right? Vouchers are the most restrictive, meaning that you would not be able to use it for anything other than for which it is given to you. Right? So the system and logistics work quite well. Then you can only access education through the voucher. Right? Conditional cash transfer has some leeway for the parents. Of course, they have to maintain minimum attendance in the school. But at the same time, obviously, cash can be used for other things. Cash is more fungible. Of course, in the first method of unconditional cash transfer, cash is fully fungible. You can use the cash for anything you like, including education. Right? So it also, in a sense, gives some idea about the level of trust we have among our own citizens. The level of trust is higher. You would want to give them more free hand, give them unconditional cash transfer. As the trust declines, you will begin to tie their hands by conditional cash transfer or through a voucher or reimbursement way of implementing DBT. These are the examples in India that relate to some of the key aspects of education challenge. So we have one example which increases enrollment and attendance in schools. This is an example that comes from Orissa, the Orissa Girls Incentive Program, which gives about 3,000 rupees a year on average to girls, SC/ST girls. Later, they also included boys in the program who pass out from class 8 and are entering class 9. Right? So for 9 and 10, they get a conditional cash transfer, which is dependent on the attendance in the school of 70% attendance rate they have to maintain. Right? A small pilot program that was done earlier, then was rolled out to the whole state, and it has been, at least anecdotally, quite successful. there has not been any rigorous third-party assessment of the program. So we don't really know the extent of the impact. And of course, was it geographically spread or only in certain areas of the Orissa where the program was implemented? We do not know for sure what was the impact on the learning outcomes of the attendance rate that increased of the girls that took the program. So we do not have the details of the impact, but we know broadly in terms of what government reports are suggesting and what the implementing agencies are telling us, that has a positive impact in some enrollment. Of course, many more girls continued in the school than they would have continued without the program, right? And given the attendance and other things that happened during the program, it did improve the learning outcome. The second is children education allowance. This is actually particularly a scheme for the central government and in many cases state government employees. Some of you probably know that for central government employees, they get up to 25,000 rupees as a reimbursement on the tuition and school expenses, and up to 45,000 rupees for hostel expenses, right? So there's a reimbursement program, in a sense, that the government runs for its own employees, right? And of course, as you can see, that promotes choice for the employees of the government, right? Of course, at one level, the central government employees already have access to Kendriya Vidyalayas, right, which is run for them, right? In addition to having KVs, they also have a reimbursement program where they can choose a school they want to send to, and part of the fees, at least up to 25,000, is paid by the government. The third, in terms of learning outcome improvement, we have 2 or 3 small pilot programs in India. One that was done by CCS, the first sort of voucher program in India in 2007, right? And then there was another program done called Unable by ARC, which is a UK-based charity. They did a program for about 800 students in the same area of East Delhi, where we had run the program earlier. We were also advisor to ARC in terms of designing of the program. So both of those programs show quite clearly the improvement learning outcomes, right? Of course, there are challenges in terms of the focusing on the socioeconomic profile of the parents and accounting for those parental behavior and background. But despite accounting for that, you see an improvement in learning outcomes of those kids who got a voucher versus those who did not get a voucher. And we have a very large program run in Andhra Pradesh. A school choice project in Andhra Pradesh that ran for almost 4 years. Looked at many issues in terms of the choice and incentives for teachers for better performance, focus on learning outcomes. Right. One, I think, key learning, despite there are many learnings in the program, but one key learning that is relevant for us is the value for money. The program very clearly outlines and demonstrates that is 1/3 the cost of what government spends in government schools. You can achieve similar results in private school, right? 1/3 the cost. Of course, many of us argue that it's far cheaper than that. At least the project argues that 1/3 is what you would have to spend to achieve the same results that you get in a government school, right? That's a huge value for money for taxpayers and citizens of India. So that's I think, 4 big buckets of challenges, some of the pilot programs that we already have in India that give some overview of how to think about these issues in the Indian context. Some considerations for design. This is something we have sort of taken from large experiences, an experiment which are being done around the world. What is the learning from those experiments? And just sort of trying to summarize that here quickly for you. So one, I think, good learning, at least in Indian context, are conditions necessary? So the Orissa Girls program was actually a conditional cash transfer, where you had to attend 70% of the attendance in the school to be able to continue to get the money, right? Turned out that there was no system to check attendance. It was very difficult to implement that system in Orissa. So in practice, there was not really much verification of the attendance rate. But the government kept saying that this is for education, right? So they kept repeating in various ways to the parents that this money that is given to you is for education. And for some reason, that seemed to have worked, right? And it turns out that none of the parents who initially thought the condition were attached to the program, when the program started, their attendance would be measured. Later, they found out they are not measuring attendance. Right? Even then, they did not drop out of the program or did not stop sending girls to school. Right? So in a sense, behavior that was nudged, you can say, continued as it is, despite the knowledge that no longer attendance is being measured. Right? So it's an interesting sort of way of thinking about how you can nudge people even without having to enforce conditionality too strongly. Right? We know the example of Bihar bicycle, which was a very similar situation where simply people were requested to buy a bicycle with the money that was given to them. And we know almost 90% of them actually bought bicycle with it. Right? So there are ways in which maybe it's a cultural factor, I'm not sure, which allows us to then nudge people in a way without having to enforce conditionalities too strongly. The third part of the design is transfer structure, amount of money that you are going to give in the voucher or in the direct benefit transfer program, what frequency at which you will give the money to the school or to the parent, right? And of course, who is the recipient? In most cases, obviously, recipients are mothers and not fathers. This traditional now is an established tradition in most of the development work where money goes to the mother's account and not to the father's account. I'll talk briefly about the amount of transfer in the next slide. The last point is about targeted versus universal. I think there's an interesting debate, and I'm sure when the panel that will discuss about this, about universal basic income, will address this issue in more detail. What sense does it make to target these programs and where it is likely to be better to make it universal? Right. I think a good example we have is LPG subsidy in India, which in a sense allowed many people to be in, then slowly people had to opt out voluntarily if they choose to, and we were able to sort of contain the level of subsidy by voluntary opt-out. Right? So there are ways in which you can make program universal and then ask people to opt out of the program who don't really need the help. Right? The amount of transfer, currently the 25% seats in RTE are linked to the expenditure of the government in government school per student, right? Which is what the government reimburses private schools for those 25% seats. Right? Some cases, of course, you can tie the amount to be reimbursed to the school fee, which is quite difficult to do, as you can imagine, to figure out what the school fees actually are and then pay exactly that much amount. I think in this context, what is important to keep in mind is the school fee structure in private schools. Right? Most of us think of private schools as very elite, high-fee private schools. But the data actually shows from the NSSO survey is that 25% of kids who go to private schools pay less than 200 rupees a month. The 1/4 pay less than 200 rupees a month. Right? 57% pay less than 500. 82% pay less than 1,000 rupees a month. So only 3.6% actually pay more than 2,500 rupees a month. Right? And so government expenditure in, of course, any state, right, will be higher than 1,000 rupees a month in almost every situation. Right? So if you give at least that much money, you'll cover 85%, 82% of the schools very well. Some, of course, below that will get far more money than they actually charge. Right? So in some sense, the fee structures in private schools are not as high as it may appear to be. And therefore, it's possible to be generous about the amount that can be transferred under DBT. Some of the challenges in terms of implementation, I think nothing new here. We are all quite familiar with the logistical challenge of setting up the systems. We also talk about that in the second and third panel today. How do you make the Aadhaar enable? Bank transfers are not easy to do. We know even bank accounts opening is not that easy to do in many parts of the country even now. Right? So there are lots of challenges in terms of logistics of running this program. And it's true that you can't really solve challenges for one single program, just for education. It may be better to combine many such programs under DBT, and thereby it becomes easier and financially viable to address these challenges in a more effective manner. A couple of ideas in terms of what thing can be done along with DBT to make sure the DBT works effectively. Right? So one, of course, is a supply side response. One reason why we see long queues every year for admissions in Delhi and many cities of India is the supply of schools is not as high, at least supply of good quality schools, right? And therefore, one suggestion we make in the report is that we should make it easy to open schools, thereby attract more genuine players as opposed to real estate and politically connected people who currently dominate the scene. Build accountability systems, basically arguing that let's measure learning outcomes. NAS obviously has been doing it, ASSER has been doing it, but there is a need to do more systematically, rigorously, and annually the learning outcome assessment, and thereby use that as a metric for enforcing accountability on private schools as well as on government schools. And obviously, we want parents to make an informed choice. There's an important role to be played by government, by NGOs, and by schools to make sure the parents have enough information in a timely manner to be able to make those decisions in an informed way. Right? I think there is an important role to be played in helping parents to make an informed choice among schools, either government or private. Quick couple of ideas in terms of how it can be implemented. The one, I think, simple way to implement the DBT in education is to convert 25% seats under RTE to DBT. Instead of paying that money to schools, pay that money to parents, and let parents then pay the money to schools. Right? It also addresses some of the other concerns that people have raised in terms of schools with low fees collecting much higher reimbursement amount at the government expenditure level. Right? And government has no way to control that behavior of private schools. So it makes sense to give that money to parents. Excess money would be used by parents and would not go to the schools. I think biggest challenge and I think biggest use of DBT as of now is for secondary education. Right? As we have universal enrollment in elementary education, many more children are going to come out of class 8 looking to go to class 9 and 10 and 11 and 12. Right? We have a huge shortage of supply in government sector for secondary schools. Right? And by some evidence, we know there's excess capacity in private schools, which provide secondary education. Right? So it can match the shortage in government sector with the excess capacity in private sector by giving DBT to those kids who come out of class 8 and want to go for secondary education. Last but not the least is the important area of skill education. Right? DBT is really very effective, very easy to implement in that sector where schools would not be able to offer many vocational training courses. You know, Delhi government has tried to do this in a couple of few schools in Delhi to offer vocational courses, but they are quite limited in number. It's difficult to build infrastructure for those courses in every school. Right? So it would have to be outside the school system where a student would have to go for a vocational training. And therefore, DBT is one quick way of making that access possible for class 9, 10, 11, 12 students who want to take that track. And the last point is what I mentioned earlier, that government has done quite well for itself. I know this is not a research-based argument. It's an advocacy argument. But it's true when you look around, the government has taken care of its own people. Right? They have a separate tier of school system for themselves. They have a sort of reimbursement for the school expenses. We heard in Haryana particularly, the judges are demanding same treatment for themselves as it is being given to government officers. Right? So question now remains, if government guys are getting it, judges are going to get it, why not for the people of India who are paying for this money? Right? So it makes sense just from the justice and fairness point of view that people of India should get as much access to direct benefit transfer as the public servants are getting. Okay, that's my presentation on DBT.